A little girl walks into a police station alone, soaked in rain, eyes wide with quiet fear. She asks just one question: "Does every dad do this?" And the room falls silent. A black officer steps forward, not knowing that what comes next will shatter hearts and change lives. What this child reveals isn't just disturbing, it's devastating. This is more than a story. It's a wake-up call. Are you watching this in the quiet of night or the middle of your day? And where in the world are you hearing her voice? Let us know, and if this moved you, like, subscribe, and stay with us. The rain hammered against the windows of Franklin Police Station that October evening, each drop creating rivulets that distorted the streetlights outside into blurry halos of yellow and white. Inside the sterile corridors of the station, Officer Angela Thomas sat at her desk in the administrative wing, her fingers moving mechanically across the keyboard as she processed paperwork that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting the quiet frustration that had settled into the lines around her eyes over the past 3 years of being relegated to desk duty. At 36, Angela possessed the kind of steady presence that should have made her invaluable on patrol, but her supervisors had made their position clear time. And again, she was too soft, too emotional, too prone to getting involved in situations that required a harder edge. They said she lacked the necessary detachment to handle real police work, that her tendency to see the person behind the problem made her unsuitable for the streets, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. The irony wasn't lost on Angela that in a profession meant to serve and protect, her natural instinct to actually serve and protect was seen as a liability. She had joined the force 8 years ago with dreams of making a real difference in her community, of being the kind of officer who could bridge the gap between law enforcement and the people they were meant to help. Instead, she found herself trapped behind a desk filing reports and answering phones, while her colleagues handled the cases that mattered. The worst part wasn't the boredom or even the subtle discrimination she faced as one of only 3 black officers in the department. It was the growing sense that she was failing to live up to the promise she had made to herself as a young woman who had grown up in the foster care system, bounced from home to home, never quite finding the safety and protection she desperately needed. She had sworn that when she grew up, she would be the person she had wished for during those long, lonely nights when no one came to check if she was afraid, if she was hurt, if she simply needed someone to tell her that everything would be okay. The sound of the station's front door slamming open cut through the steady hum of activity like a knife, followed immediately by the desk sergeant's gruff voice calling out for someone to handle a situation. Angela looked up from her computer screen, her trained ear picking up the urgency in his tone despite his attempt to maintain professional composure. Through the glass partition that separated the administrative area from the main lobby, she could see a small figure standing near the entrance water, pooling at their feet on the polished linoleum floor. The child appeared to be shivering, whether from cold or fear, Angela couldn't tell from this distance, but something about the way the small shoulders were hunched forward, the way the head was tilted down, as if trying to become invisible, sent a familiar chill down Angela's spine. She had stood in similar positions countless times as a child, waiting in unfamiliar places while adults decided her fate, hoping to make herself small enough that maybe this time, maybe this once, someone would look at her with kindness instead of inconvenience. Without conscious thought, Angela found herself rising from her chair, her hand already reaching for the door handle that would take her from the safety of her administrative cocoon into the unpredictable world of human crisis that her supervisors insisted she wasn't equipped to handle. The paperwork on her desk could wait, the reports could be filed later, because standing in that lobby was a child who needed someone to see them, to acknowledge their presence, to recognize that whatever had brought them to a police station on a night like this was probably the worst thing that had ever happened in their young life. As Angela moved through the corridors toward the lobby, she could feel her heart rate increasing, not from nervousness, but from a sense of purpose that had been dormant for too long. A recognition that this moment, this child, this opportunity to be exactly who she had always meant to be was finally here. The little girl couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her blonde hair plastered to her head by the rain, her light blue dress clinging to her thin frame in a way that made her appear even smaller and more vulnerable than her size suggested. What struck Angela most powerfully, however, were the child's eyes. pale blue, like winter ice, but filled with a depth of sadness that no child should ever carry. Those eyes darted nervously around the busy lobby, taking in the uniformed officers, the ringing phones, the general chaos of a police station during shift change, and Angela could see the exact moment when the overwhelming nature of the environment threatened to send the little girl running back into the storm. Moving with deliberate calm, Angela approached slowly, her hands visible and open, her voice soft but clear enough to cut through the ambient noise of the station. "Hi there, sweetheart," Angela said, crouching down to bring herself to the child's eye level, a gesture that immediately transformed the dynamic from adult authority figure towering over a small child to two people having a conversation between equals. "My name is Officer Thomas, but you can call me Angela if you'd like. You look like you've had a really hard day, and I'm wondering if maybe you came here because you need someone to talk to." The little girl's response came in a voice so quiet Angela had to lean forward to hear it properly, the words tumbling out in a rush, as if they had been held back for so long that once the dam broke, everything had to come out at once. "My daddy says I'm not supposed to bother people, and I know you're probably really busy with important things, but I need to ask someone something and I didn't know where else to go because everyone always says if you need help, you should go to the police. But now, I'm here. And I don't know if this is the kind of help you do." The question that followed hit Angela like a physical blow, not because of its complexity, but because of its heartbreaking simplicity, the kind of question that could only come from a child who had been forced to question the most basic assumptions about love and family and what it meant to be worthy of affection. Is it normal for daddies to not want to hug their little girls unless they get perfect grades? Because I tried really hard on my spelling test. I studied every night for a whole week, but I only got a 92 instead of 100. And when I asked if I could have a hug anyway, because I was sad about missing those words, my daddy said that hugs are for when you earn them, not when you fail. The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence, and Angela felt something deep in her chest crack open, a wound that had never fully healed, suddenly exposed to the fluorescent lights of the police station lobby. She had heard thousands of stories during her years on the force, had listened to accounts of violence and neglect that would have broken most people, but there was something about the matter-of-fact way this little girl spoke about conditional love that cut through every professional barrier Angela had ever built around her heart. The child wasn't crying, wasn't dramatic or attention-seeking in the way adults sometimes expected traumatized children to be. She was simply standing there in her soaked dress asking the most fundamental question a child could ask. Am I worthy of love just as I am, or do I have to earn every scrap of affection that comes my way? Angela recognized the question because she had asked it herself countless times during her own childhood, whispering it into the darkness of unfamiliar bedrooms in foster homes, where love was always contingent on good behavior, good grades, being the kind of child who didn't cause problems or need too much attention. Without thinking about department protocols or the proper procedures for dealing with minors who walk into police stations unaccompanied, Angela made a decision that would later be questioned by her supervisors, but which felt in that moment like the only human response possible. She sat down completely on the cold linoleum floor, her uniform pants absorbing the dampness that had dripped from the child's clothes, and looked directly into those pale blue eyes that held far too much understanding for someone who should still believe in fairy tales and happy endings. Angela's voice, when she spoke, carried none of the professional distance she had been trained to maintain. Instead, it was warm and immediate, the voice of someone who had once been exactly where this little girl was standing, someone who understood that sometimes the most important conversations happen between two people sitting on the floor of a busy lobby while the world rushes past them, too busy to notice that someone small and vulnerable is drowning right in plain sight. "Sweetheart, can you tell me your name?" Angela asked, her hands resting palm up on her knees in a gesture of openness that she hoped would communicate safety without words. "And honey, I need you to know that what your daddy told you about hugs, that's not how love is supposed to work. Love isn't something you earn with perfect grades or good behavior. Love is something that should be there no matter what, especially between a daddy and his little girl." The child's response came in that same small voice, but Angela caught something new in it, now a tiny spark of hope mixed with the fear, as if someone had finally said something that matched what she had always felt in her heart, but had been told was wrong. My name is Emily Parker, and I'm 8 years old, and I know I'm not supposed to talk to strangers, but you're a police officer, so that makes it okay, right? And what you just said about love, about how it's supposed to be there, no matter what. That's what I used to think too, back when my mommy was still alive. She used to hug me even when I spilled juice on my dress or forgot to brush my teeth, and she would say that mommies and daddies love their children just because they're their children, not because of anything special they do. But my mommy died when I was 5, and ever since then, my daddy has been different, like he forgot how to love me the way she did, and now I have to be perfect all the time, or he gets this look on his face like I'm disappointing him in some terrible way. Angela felt her throat tighten as Emily's story unfolded each detail, painting a picture that was both heartbreakingly specific and universally recognizable to anyone who had ever been a child trying to navigate the incomprehensible world of adult emotions and expectations. The little girl's words came faster now, as if a dam had broken and years of carefully held secrets were finally finding their way to the surface. And Angela realized that she was probably the first adult who had ever asked Emily these questions, the first person who had ever suggested that her feelings about her father's behavior might be valid rather than evidence of her own inadequacy. The lobby around them continued its usual chaos of ringing phones and busy officers, but Angela found herself able to block out everything except Emily's voice and the way her small hands twisted together in her lap as she spoke, a gesture that reminded Angela so strongly of her own childhood nervous habits that she had to consciously resist the urge to reach out and still those anxious fingers with her own steady touch. "Emily, I want you to listen to me very carefully," Angela said, leaning forward slightly to close the distance between them without invading the child's personal space, her voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that comes not from a badge or uniform, but from genuine care and hard-won wisdom. "What happened to your mommy? That's the worst kind of sadness that can happen to a family. And sometimes when grown-ups are dealing with that kind of pain, they forget how to show love the right way. But that doesn't mean you did anything wrong, and it doesn't mean you have to earn your daddy's love by being perfect. You are already perfect just by being you, just by being his little girl who loves him even when he doesn't know how to love you back the way you need him to." The moment those words left Angela's lips, she watched Emily's carefully maintained composure finally crack, and the tears that had been held back by sheer force of will began to slide down her cheeks, not the dramatic sobbing of a child having a tantrum, but the quiet, exhausted crying of someone who had been carrying too heavy a burden for far too long. Angela's instincts told her to gather this child into her arms to provide the physical comfort that Emily so desperately needed, but her training and the reality of their situation held her back, reminding her that she was a police officer dealing with what appeared to be a case of emotional neglect, and that every action she took from this moment forward would be scrutinized by supervisors, social workers, and possibly attorneys if Emily's father decided to challenge whatever intervention might be necessary to ensure his daughter's well-being. "Emily, honey, I need to ask you some questions that might be hard to answer, but I promise you that everything you tell me is going to help us figure out how to make things better for you," Angela said, pulling a small notebook from her shirt pocket, but keeping it closed for now, not wanting to make this conversation feel like an official interrogation, when what Emily needed most was simply to be heard and believed. "Can you tell me what your daddy does when you don't get perfect grades? Does he just not give you hugs, or does he do other things that make you feel scared or sad?" The question seemed to open another floodgate in Emily's memory, and she began to describe a household ruled by rigid expectations and emotional distance, a place where love was dispensed like a reward for achievement rather than offered as the birthright of every child. She spoke of silent dinners where every bite was monitored, of bedtime routines devoid of stories, or songs of a father who seemed to have forgotten that children need more than food and shelter to thrive. They need warmth and affection and the absolute certainty that they are valued for who they are rather than what they accomplish. As Emily talked, Angela found herself thinking about her own childhood, about the foster homes where love was similarly conditional, where good behavior might earn you a kind word, but where the underlying message was always clear: you are here on sufferance, and you must constantly prove your worth or risk being sent away to somewhere even worse. Sometimes I think maybe if I could just be good enough, smart enough, quiet enough, then maybe my daddy would remember how to love me the way he used to before Mommy died." Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper now, as if speaking these thoughts aloud was a betrayal of some unspoken family rule about keeping private pain private. "But I'm starting to think that maybe I'm just not the kind of little girl who deserves to be loved. Maybe there's something wrong with me that makes it hard for people to want to hug me or tell me they're proud of me, even when I make mistakes." The words hit Angela like a physical blow, not just because of their content, but because of their terrible familiarity, the echo of every doubt she had ever harbored about her own worthiness of love and acceptance. In that moment, sitting on the floor of the police station lobby with this brave, broken little girl, Angela understood that this case was going to be different from anything she had ever handled before, not just because of the complexity of the legal and social issues involved, but because Emily's story was forcing her to confront the wounded child that still lived inside her own heart, the part of herself that had never quite believed she deserved the kind of unconditional love that every child should be able to take for granted. While Angela sat on that cold floor listening to Emily's heartbreaking revelations 15 miles across town in the prestigious law offices of Parker and Associates, Gregory Parker was experiencing his own kind of torment, though he would never have described it in such vulnerable terms. At 43, Gregory had built his reputation on his ability to remain emotionally detached from even the most disturbing cases that crossed his mahogany desk, a skill that had served him well in representing clients accused of domestic violence, child abuse, and other crimes that required a lawyer who could compartmentalize human suffering in service of legal strategy. His corner office on the 20th floor overlooked the city's financial district, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view that spoke of success and power. Yet, as Gregory sat reviewing case files in the amber glow of his desk lamp, the very detachment that had made him wealthy was slowly destroying the one relationship that mattered more than any court victory or client testimonial. The irony was not lost on him that he spent his days defending men accused of harming their families, while simultaneously failing to provide his own daughter with the emotional nourishment she desperately needed. But acknowledging that irony would have required a level of self-reflection that Gregory had been avoiding for the 3 years since his wife's death had turned his world upside down and left him responsible for raising a little girl whose very existence reminded him of everything he had lost. The framed photograph on his desk showed a different man, entirely a Gregory from 4 years ago, who smiled easily and held his wife Sarah in one arm, while Emily, then only 4 years old, sat perched on his shoulders with her tiny hands tangled in his hair and her face bright with the kind of unrestrained joy that only children can manage. That Gregory had been quick to laugh, eager to engage in Emily's endless questions about everything from why the sky was blue to whether unicorns might be hiding in their backyard garden, and he had possessed an intuitive understanding of what his daughter needed from him at any given moment, whether it was a gentle explanation of why she couldn't have ice cream for breakfast, or the kind of enthusiastic praise that made her beam with pride over a crayon drawing that would have been incomprehensible to anyone else, but which he saw as a masterpiece worthy of refrigerator display. The transformation had not happened overnight, but rather through a series of small retreats into emotional self-protection that began the moment Sarah was diagnosed with cancer and accelerated dramatically after her death. Each withdrawal justified in Gregory's mind as necessary for maintaining the stability that Emily needed in order to survive the loss of her mother without losing her father as well to grief and despair. The problem, as Gregory had come to understand it during the long hours he spent alone in his office, reviewing legal briefs and trying not to think about bedtime stories he no longer read or goodnight kisses he no longer gave, was that grief had a way of disguising itself as strength, of convincing a man that emotional distance was the same thing as emotional stability, that protecting a child from his pain was more important than sharing with her the full range of human feeling that makes love possible in the first place. He had convinced himself that Emily needed a father who was reliable and consistent, rather than one who might break down crying in the middle of helping her with homework because the sight of her concentrating so intently reminded him of the way Sarah used to bite her lower lip when she was working on a particularly challenging crossword puzzle. The rules he had imposed on their household after Sarah's death, The rigid schedules and conditional affection and emphasis on achievement over emotional expression had seemed like necessary structure at the time, a way of ensuring that Emily would grow up disciplined and self-sufficient rather than needy and emotionally dependent on others who might also leave her someday. What Gregory could not allow himself to acknowledge, even in the privacy of his own thoughts, was that his approach to parenting had less to do with Emily's needs than with his own fear of breaking down completely, of allowing himself to feel the full weight of losing the only person who had ever loved him unconditionally and who had taught him that vulnerability was not weakness, but rather the foundation upon which real intimacy was built. Sarah had possessed an emotional intelligence that complemented his analytical mind perfectly, and she had been the bridge between Gregory's natural inclination toward intellectual problem-solving and Emily's childish need for warmth, affection, and the kind of spontaneous expressions of love that came naturally to some people, but which Gregory had always found mysteriously difficult to manage. Without Sarah to translate Emily's emotional needs into terms he could understand, Gregory had defaulted to treating his daughter like a client whose problems could be solved through the application of logic and discipline, never realizing that what she needed from him was not solutions, but simply the assurance that she was loved completely and unconditionally, regardless of her performance in school or her ability to follow the increasingly complex set of rules he had established to maintain order in their household. The call from Franklin Police Station came at exactly 9:47 that evening, interrupting Gregory's review of a brief for a case that was scheduled for trial the following week. And the voice on the other end of the line was professional, but carried an undertone of concern that immediately set his teeth on edge because it suggested that whatever had happened involved more than the simple administrative error he initially assumed was the reason for the contact. Officer Angela Thomas identified herself and explained that Emily was safe, but that she had come to the police station asking questions that suggested she might be experiencing some difficulties at home, and she wondered if Gregory might be available to come in for a conversation about how they might work together to ensure Emily's well-being moving forward. The words hit Gregory like a physical blow, not because he didn't understand their implications, but because he understood them too well, recognizing in the careful phrasing the kind of language that social services workers and police officers use when they are trying to determine whether a child is being harmed by the very people who are supposed to protect them. Gregory's first instinct was to respond with the same aggressive defensiveness that had served him well in countless courtroom battles, to demand to know by what authority the police were questioning his daughter without his presence, and to threaten legal action against anyone who might dare to suggest that he was anything less than a devoted father who had sacrificed everything to provide Emily with the stability and security she needed after losing her mother. But even as the familiar rush of combative energy surged through his system, Gregory found himself remembering Emily's face that morning when she had shown him her spelling test with its score of 92 out of 100, the way her eyes had searched his expression for some sign of approval or pride, and how he had simply nodded and told her that next time she should study harder so that she wouldn't make such careless mistakes. He remembered the way her shoulders had sagged slightly, the barely perceptible slump that indicated disappointment, and how she had quietly put the test away in her backpack without saying another word, accepting his criticism as her due, rather than arguing or asking for the encouragement that any other child her age would have demanded as their birthright. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Gregory heard himself saying, his voice sounding strange and distant even to his own ears, and as he gathered his coat and car keys, he found himself wondering what Emily had told the police that had prompted this call, what truths about their life together she had shared with strangers that he had been too emotionally unavailable to hear himself. The drive to the police station passed in a blur of streetlights and traffic signals, Gregory's mind racing through possible scenarios and legal strategies, while his heart hammered against his ribs with a fear that had nothing to do with professional consequences and everything to do with the growing realization that he might have failed Emily in ways that went far deeper than he had ever allowed himself to consider. By the time he pulled into the parking lot of Franklin Police Station, Gregory Parker, the successful attorney, had been replaced by Gregory Parker, the terrified father, a man who was about to confront the possibility that his attempts to protect his daughter from his own emotional instability had instead created a different kind of harm, one that might prove even more difficult to heal than the grief that had started this whole terrible process in the first place. By the time Gregory's Mercedes pulled into the police station parking lot, Angela had managed to coax Emily into accepting a dry blanket and a cup of hot chocolate from the station's break room, though the little girl still sat perched on the edge of her chair, as if ready to flee. At any moment, her small hands wrapped around the warm mug like it was an anchor in a storm she couldn't quite understand. The administrative area had grown quieter as the evening shift settled into their routines, but Angela remained acutely aware that their conversation existed in a delicate bubble that could be shattered by the wrong word or gesture, and she found herself moving with the kind of careful deliberation she had learned during her own childhood when navigating the unpredictable moods of foster parents who might be kind one moment and explosive the next. Emily had begun to open up in small increments, sharing details about her daily life that painted a picture of emotional deprivation disguised as structure and discipline, and Angela realized that what she was witnessing was not the dramatic kind of abuse that typically brought children to police stations, but rather something more insidious and harder to quantify: the slow erosion of a child's sense of self-worth through the systematic withholding of the affection and validation that should have been as automatic as breathing. The moment Gregory Parker walked through the station doors, Angela felt the temperature in the room shift in a way that had nothing to do with the October weather outside and everything to do with the carefully controlled energy that seemed to radiate from the man who had clearly rushed from his office without taking time to prepare for what might await him. Even in his obvious distress, Gregory carried himself with the kind of authority that came from years of commanding courtrooms and intimidating opposing counsel, his expensive suit and perfectly styled hair creating an image of success and competence that would have been impressive under different circumstances, but which now seemed almost jarring in contrast to his daughter's obvious emotional fragility. Angela watched Emily's reaction to her father's entrance with the trained eye of someone who had learned to read children's responses to the adults in their lives, and what she saw confirmed her worst fears about the dynamic between this father and daughter, the way Emily seemed to shrink into herself and adopt an expression of careful neutrality that no 8-year-old should have mastered so thoroughly. "Emily, what are you doing here?" Gregory's voice carried the controlled tone he used in professional settings, but Angela caught the undercurrent of panic that he was working hard to suppress, and she realized that beneath his composed exterior, this man was experiencing the kind of fear that only comes when someone you love is in danger and you're not sure how to protect them. "You should have called me if something was wrong, not wandered off to bother these officers with whatever problem you think you're having." The words hit Emily like a physical blow, and Angela watched the little girl's face close down completely, all the progress they had made during their conversation evaporating as Emily retreated into the protective shell of compliance and self-blame that had apparently become her default response to her father's disapproval. It was a reaction that Angela recognized from her own childhood, the automatic assumption of guilt and responsibility that children develop when they live with adults who are too damaged or distracted to provide consistent emotional support, and she felt a surge of protective anger on Emily's behalf that she had to work hard to channel into professional composure rather than the kind of confrontational response that would only make the situation worse for everyone involved. "Mr. Parker, I'm Officer Angela Thomas, and I want to assure you that Emily hasn't done anything wrong," Angela said, rising from her chair and extending her hand in a gesture that was both professional courtesy and subtle assertion of her authority in this situation. "Your daughter came here tonight because she had some questions about family relationships that she needed help understanding, and I think it would be beneficial for all of us to sit down and talk about how we can work together to make sure she feels supported and heard at home." Gregory's handshake was firm and brief, his lawyer's instincts clearly engaged as he processed Angela's carefully chosen words and began to formulate his response. But Angela could see something else flickering behind his professional mask, a vulnerability that he was working desperately to hide, but which spoke to the genuine love he felt for his daughter, even if he had forgotten how to express it in ways that she could understand and accept. The silence that followed stretched between them like a chasm filled with all the unspoken accusations and defenses that neither adult wanted to voice in front of Emily, who sat watching this interaction between the two most important people in her immediate world with the kind of intense attention that children develop when their survival depends on accurately reading the emotional weather around them. I don't understand what Emily could have told you that would require this kind of intervention, Gregory said finally, his tone carefully measured, but with an edge that suggested he was already building the mental framework for whatever legal battle he assumed was coming. She's a well-cared-for child who attends private school, receives excellent medical care, and lives in a safe, comfortable home where all of her needs are met. If she's given you some impression that she's being mistreated, then I think there's been a serious misunderstanding that we need to clear up immediately. Angela recognized the response as the kind of defensive reaction she had encountered countless times from parents who equated providing material necessities with meeting all of a child's needs, and she found herself thinking about the foster homes where she had received adequate food and shelter but had starved for the kind of emotional nourishment that Gregory seemed incapable of recognizing as essential to his daughter's well-being. The challenge she faced was finding a way to help this man understand that Emily's pain was real and significant without triggering the kind of adversarial dynamic that would make it impossible for them to work together toward a solution that prioritized the little girl's needs above the adult's fears and pride. Mr. Parker, I can see that you love Emily very much, and I know this situation must be frightening and confusing for you, Angela said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that had served her well in crisis situations, even though her supervisors had consistently undervalued her ability to de-escalate conflict through genuine empathy rather than intimidation or force. But I need you to understand that your daughter came here tonight asking questions about whether it's normal for fathers to withhold affection from their children unless they achieve perfect performance, and that suggests she's struggling with some feelings that we need to take seriously if we want to help her feel secure and loved in your home. The words landed like bombs in the quiet space of the administrative area, and Angela watched Gregory's face cycle through a series of emotions that he couldn't quite control: surprise giving way to defensive anger before settling into something that looked uncomfortably like recognition. Emily remained silent throughout this exchange, her eyes moving back and forth between the adults as if she were watching a tennis match, but Angela could see the way her small body tensed with each word, the way she seemed to be holding her breath, waiting for someone to tell her that her feelings were wrong or inappropriate or somehow her own fault for being too sensitive or demanding. Emily, is that what you told Officer Thomas? Gregory asked, turning to address his daughter directly for the first time since entering the station, and Angela heard something in his voice shift the professional distance, giving way to something more personal and uncertain. That I don't show you affection unless you get perfect grades. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither Gregory nor Emily seemed prepared to confront directly, but Angela could see that this moment represented a crucial turning point in their relationship, the first time in months, or perhaps years, that Gregory had asked his daughter a question about her emotional experience rather than simply issuing instructions or corrections about her behavior. Emily's response when it came was barely audible, but it carried the weight of years of accumulated hurt and confusion that had finally found a voice through the safety that Angela had somehow managed to create in this unlikely setting. I just wanted to know if other daddies are like you, or if maybe I'm doing something wrong that makes it hard for you to love me the way you used to when Mommy was still alive. The silence that followed Angela's impassioned declaration stretched across the conference room like a living thing, heavy with the weight of truths that had been spoken aloud for the first time in a setting where such raw honesty was neither expected nor particularly welcome, and Angela could feel her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized that there was no taking back what she had just said. No retreat into the comfortable anonymity of being just another professional doing her job according to established protocols and procedures. Sarah Monroe sat frozen at her end of the table, her pen hovering over her notepad as if she had been in the middle of writing something when Angela's words had stopped her mid-thought, and the expression on her face suggested that she was struggling to process not just the content of what Angela had said, but the way it had been delivered with a kind of fierce conviction that challenged everything Sarah thought she understood about how these proceedings were supposed to unfold. Gregory's attorney had leaned back in his chair with the carefully neutral expression that lawyers adopt when they are trying to assess whether something unexpected might work to their client's advantage or disadvantage. But Gregory himself had gone very still, in a way that reminded Angela of a person who has just received news that will change everything about how they understand their life and their place in the world. The first person to break the silence was Judge Patricia Williams, a woman in her early 60s whose reputation for fairness and common sense had made her a respected figure in the family court system, but who had clearly not anticipated having to navigate the kind of emotional minefield that Angela's testimony had created in what should have been a routine hearing about custody arrangements and support services. Judge Williams had been listening to the proceedings with the kind of patient attention that comes from years of experience with cases that involve children caught between well-meaning adults who cannot agree on what constitutes their best interests. But Angela's words had obviously struck something deeper than professional interest, and when she spoke, her voice carried a thoughtfulness that had not been present during the earlier, more procedural portions of the hearing. "Officer Thomas, I want to make sure I understand what you're telling us here." Judge Williams said, her hands folded on the desk in front of her in a gesture that suggested she was prepared to give Angela's concerns the serious consideration they deserved, rather than dismissing them as the emotional outburst of someone who had overstepped her professional boundaries. "Are you saying that, in your opinion, Emily's current living situation constitutes a form of emotional neglect that requires immediate intervention, despite the fact that her basic needs are being met and there is no evidence of physical abuse or deliberate cruelty on her father's part?" Angela felt the eyes of everyone in the room focusing on her with an intensity that might have been intimidating under different circumstances, but she found that speaking her truth had created a kind of clarity that made it easier rather than harder to continue, as if finally acknowledging the connections between her own childhood experiences and Emily's current situation had given her access to a source of strength and conviction that she had not known she possessed. She looked directly at Judge Williams, recognizing in the older woman's expression something that suggested a willingness to listen that went beyond mere professional courtesy, and she realized that this might be the only opportunity she would ever have to advocate for Emily in a way that could actually make a difference in the little girl's life. "Your Honor, what I'm saying is that Emily is living in a home where love and affection are treated as rewards that must be earned through perfect behavior and academic achievement, and that this approach to parenting is causing her to develop beliefs about her own worth that will damage her ability to form healthy relationships and trust in her own value as a human being for the rest of her life." Angela said, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of what she was asserting and the potential consequences for her own career if her intervention was viewed as inappropriate or unprofessional. "Mr. Parker is not a bad man, and I don't believe he intends to harm his daughter, but his inability to express unconditional love and acceptance is creating a situation where Emily is slowly learning that she is only valuable when she meets adult expectations, and that lesson is going to follow her into every relationship and every challenge she faces as she grows up." Gregory's face had been growing increasingly pale during Angela's testimony, and now he leaned forward slightly in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table with enough force that his knuckles had turned white. And when he spoke, his voice carried a tremor that suggested he was struggling to maintain the professional composure that had served as his primary defense mechanism throughout the proceedings. "Officer Thomas, I think you're making some very serious accusations based on a very limited understanding of my relationship with my daughter." Gregory said, his words carefully measured, but edged with the kind of controlled anger that lawyers learn to deploy when they need to regain control of a situation that has moved beyond their comfort zone. "Emily is a well-cared-for child who receives everything she needs to thrive and succeed, and I resent the implication that providing structure and expectations for her behavior somehow constitutes emotional abuse or neglect." Angela could see that Gregory's response was coming from a place of genuine pain and defensive fear rather than simple arrogance or dismissiveness, and she realized that this moment represented a crucial opportunity to reach past his professional armor to the grieving father who was desperately trying to do right by his daughter while being completely unprepared for the emotional complexity of single parenting in the aftermath of devastating loss. She softened her voice slightly, not backing down from her position, but acknowledging the humanity in Gregory's struggle because she understood that attacking him personally would only make him more defensive and less likely to hear what Emily actually needed from him. Mr. Parker, I can see how much you love Emily, and I know that everything you're doing comes from a desire to protect her and give her the best possible foundation for her future, Angela said, leaning forward slightly to close the physical distance between them without invading his personal space, her tone carrying the kind of gentle authority that comes from speaking difficult truths with compassion rather than judgment. But I need you to understand that Emily doesn't need more structure or higher expectations right now. What she needs is to know that your love for her is not dependent on her performance, that she can make mistakes and still be worthy of affection, that she can be sad or scared or confused and still deserve comfort and reassurance from the person who matters most to her in the world. The words seemed to hit Gregory like physical blows, and Angela watched as his carefully maintained composure began to crack in ways that revealed the depth of his own pain and confusion, the way he had been struggling to be both mother and father to Emily while dealing with his own grief and terror of making mistakes that might damage the only person left in his life who connected him to the woman he had loved and lost. His attorney placed a warning hand on his arm, clearly concerned that any display of emotion might be used against his client in ways that could affect the outcome of the custody determination, but Gregory seemed to have moved beyond the point where legal strategy mattered more than the truth about his relationship with his daughter. I don't know how to do this, Gregory said, his voice breaking slightly on the words in a way that stripped away all pretense of professional competence and revealed the frightened, grieving man beneath the expensive suit and carefully styled hair. Sarah was the one who knew how to comfort Emily when she was upset, who knew exactly what to say when she had a bad dream or was worried about something at school. I'm a lawyer. I solve problems through logic and structure and clear expectations. But Emily isn't a legal brief that I can analyze and fix through the application of the right procedures and precedents. Angela felt something in her chest loosen at Gregory's admission, a recognition that beneath his rigid parenting approach was a man who was drowning in responsibilities he had never been prepared to handle alone, and she realized that her role in this situation was not just to advocate for Emily, but also to help Gregory understand that loving his daughter did not require him to be perfect or to have all the answers, but simply to be present and available and willing to learn from his mistakes rather than hiding behind rules and expectations that protected him from vulnerability, but also prevented him from connecting with Emily in the ways she desperately needed. Mr. Parker, you don't have to know how to do everything perfectly, Angela said, her voice carrying the kind of gentle encouragement that she wished someone had offered to the foster parents who had struggled to care for her during her own childhood, people who might have been able to provide the love and stability she needed if they had understood that parenting was about showing up and trying, rather than about having all the right answers from the beginning. What Emily needs most from you is not perfection, but presence. She needs to know that you see her pain and that you care enough to learn how to help her heal, even if that means admitting that you don't have all the solutions and might need support and guidance to become the father she needs you to be. Sarah Monroe had been watching this exchange with the kind of intense focus that suggested she was beginning to see Emily's situation from a different perspective than the one that had shaped her initial recommendations, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a thoughtfulness that had been absent from her earlier, more procedural responses to the case. Officer Thomas, I have to admit that your insights into Emily's emotional state have given me some things to think about that I may not have fully considered in my initial assessment, Sarah said, her professional pride clearly warring with a growing recognition that her standardized approach to evaluating family dynamics might have missed something crucial about what this particular child needed in order to heal from the losses and disruptions that had shaped her young life in such profound ways. Perhaps we need to look at this situation not just in terms of safety and basic care, but also in terms of the kind of emotional support that Emily requires to develop into a healthy, confident young woman who believes in her own worth and value. Angela felt a surge of hope mixed with cautious optimism as she realized that her willingness to speak up and risk professional consequences might actually be creating space for a different kind of conversation about Emily's needs, one that went beyond checking boxes and following protocols to address the deeper questions about what it meant to provide a child with the foundation they needed, not just to survive, but to thrive and flourish in ways that honored their full humanity rather than reducing them to a collection of behavioral indicators and academic achievements. The breakthrough that Angela had been hoping for came not in the sterile conference room where professionals had been debating Emily's future in careful, measured tones, but rather in the quiet hallway outside where Emily herself had been waiting with the kind of patient resignation that broke Angela's heart every time she witnessed it in a child who should have been running and playing instead of learning to accommodate the complicated emotional needs of the adults around her. Judge Williams had called for a brief recess to allow everyone time to process the shift in perspective that Angela's testimony had created, and as the various professionals gathered their papers and whispered among themselves about procedural next steps, Angela found herself drawn toward the small figure sitting alone on a bench that was clearly designed for adults, her legs dangling several inches above the floor and her hands folded in her lap with the kind of careful stillness that children develop when they have learned that drawing attention to themselves might result in consequences they are not prepared to handle. Emily looked up when Angela approached, and the expression in those pale blue eyes was a mixture of hope and wariness that spoke to the complicated relationship they had developed over the past few weeks, a connection that had grown deeper and more meaningful than either of them had anticipated when Emily first walked into the police station on that rain-soaked October evening that now seemed like a lifetime ago. Angela sat down on the bench beside Emily, maintaining enough distance to respect the child's personal space, while positioning herself close enough that they could speak quietly without being overheard by the adults, who were still engaged in their professional discussions just beyond the closed door of the conference room. And she found herself struggling to find words that would be both honest and age-appropriate ways of explaining what had just happened in that room that would help Emily understand that people were fighting for her without making her feel responsible for the conflict or afraid that she might somehow be the cause of problems for the adults who were trying to help her. The weight of that responsibility felt enormous because Angela knew that whatever she said in this moment would become part of Emily's understanding of her own worth and the role she played in the complicated dynamics that had brought them all to this place. And she was acutely aware that children Emily's age had a tendency to blame themselves for adult problems in ways that could create lasting damage if not addressed with careful attention to how they interpreted the information they received about their own situations. Emily, sweetheart, I want you to know that the grown-ups in that room are all trying very hard to figure out the best way to help you feel safe and loved and happy, even though we might not always agree about what that looks like or how to make it happen. Angela said, her voice carrying the kind of gentle certainty that she had learned was essential when talking to children who had been through traumatic experiences and needed to know that the adults around them were competent and trustworthy, even when the situation felt chaotic and unpredictable. Sometimes when people care about someone as much as we all care about you, they have different ideas about what would be most helpful, and they need to talk through those differences until they can find a solution that everyone feels good about. Emily nodded solemnly, but Angela could see in her expression that she was processing this information in ways that went far deeper than simple understanding of the immediate situation, and she realized that Emily was probably trying to figure out how much of what was happening was her fault and whether there was something she could do or say that would make everything easier for the adults who seemed to be having such complicated discussions about her life and her future. It was a response that Angela recognized from her own childhood, the automatic assumption of responsibility that children develop when they live in environments where adult emotions and decisions seem unpredictable and potentially dangerous. And she knew that addressing this tendency directly was crucial if Emily was going to be able to heal from the emotional patterns that had been established during her father's period of grief-driven withdrawal from their relationship. I need you to understand something very important, Emily. Angela continued, turning slightly on the bench so that she could look directly into the little girl's eyes and make sure that her words were landing with the kind of clarity and conviction that would help them take root in Emily's understanding of herself and her place in the world. None of what's happening here is your fault, and there is nothing you could have done differently that would have prevented us from needing to have these conversations. You are not responsible for making the grown-ups in your life happy, or for fixing their problems, or for being perfect so that they don't have to worry about you." The words seemed to hit Emily with unexpected force, and Angela watched as the little girl's carefully maintained composure began to crack in ways that revealed just how much pressure she had been carrying, how much energy she had been spending on trying to be the kind of child who wouldn't cause additional stress for a father who was already dealing with more than he could handle. And Angela felt a familiar surge of protective anger on behalf of this brave, wounded child who had been forced to take on emotional burdens that belonged to the adults in her life, rather than being allowed to simply be a child who was loved and supported regardless of her behavior or achievements. "But what if I had gotten that perfect score on my spelling test?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of months of self-doubt and self-blame that had accumulated as she tried to make sense of her father's emotional distance and the changes in their relationship that had followed her mother's death. "What if I had been better at not making messes or asking for things when Daddy was tired or sad? Maybe if I had been a better daughter, he wouldn't have stopped wanting to hug me or tell me he loves me." Angela felt her heart break a little more at Emily's words, recognizing in them the same pattern of self-blame and magical thinking that she had engaged in during her own childhood, the desperate belief that if she could just be good enough, smart enough, quiet enough, then maybe the adults around her would be able to provide the love and stability she needed. And she knew that this was exactly the kind of thinking that could follow Emily into adulthood if it wasn't addressed directly and compassionately by someone who understood both the logic behind it and the damage it could cause if left unchallenged. "Oh, sweetheart," Angela said, her voice thick with emotion as she reached out slowly, giving Emily plenty of opportunity to pull away if physical comfort felt like too much. And when the little girl leaned into her touch instead of withdrawing, Angela felt a surge of tenderness that reminded her of all the reasons she had become a police officer in the first place, all the hopes she had harbored about being able to make a real difference in the lives of people who needed someone to see their pain and respond to it with genuine care and commitment. "Your daddy's sadness about losing your mommy has nothing to do with how wonderful you are, and there is nothing you could have done or not done that would have changed how he has been feeling or acting since she died." Emily was crying now, not the dramatic sobs of a child having a tantrum, but the quiet, exhausted tears of someone who had been carrying a burden too heavy for her small shoulders and was finally being given permission to set it down. And Angela found herself thinking about all the children she had encountered over the years who had learned to blame themselves for adult failures, who had developed elaborate theories about their own inadequacies as explanations for the neglect or abuse they had experienced. And she felt a renewed determination to make sure that Emily did not become another casualty of a system that was better at documenting problems than actually solving them. At that moment, the conference room door opened, and Gregory emerged, his face pale and his expression shaken in ways that suggested the conversations inside had continued to challenge his understanding of his relationship with his daughter and his role in her emotional struggles. And Angela watched as he noticed Emily's tears and seemed to struggle with how to respond, his instinctive desire to comfort her clearly warring with the emotional barriers he had constructed to protect himself from the vulnerability that came with acknowledging how much his daughter was hurting, and how much of that hurt was connected to his own inability to express love and affection in ways that she could understand and accept. "Emily, are you all right?" Gregory asked, his voice carefully controlled, but carrying an undertone of genuine concern that suggested something had shifted during the recess, some recognition or realization that had begun to crack the defensive armor he had been wearing since the proceedings began. And Angela could see that he was genuinely struggling with how to bridge the emotional distance that had developed between him and his daughter without admitting to failures that felt too dangerous to acknowledge directly. Emily looked up at her father with eyes that were still bright with tears, and Angela could see her weighing her response, trying to decide whether it was safe to be honest about her feelings or whether she needed to retreat into the protective shell of compliance and cheerfulness that had become her default way of managing her father's emotional fragility. And in that moment, Angela realized that this interaction could become a turning point in their relationship if Gregory was able to respond to his daughter's vulnerability with the kind of openness and acceptance she needed, rather than the defensive redirection that had characterized so many of their recent conversations. "Daddy, I've been trying so hard to be the perfect daughter so that you would want to hug me again, like you used to when Mommy was alive," Emily said, her voice trembling, but carrying a courage that took Angela's breath away, the courage of a child who was willing to risk rejection in order to ask for what she needed most desperately. "But I don't think I know how to be perfect enough, and I'm getting really tired of trying to earn your love instead of just having it like other kids have with their daddies." The words hung in the air between father and daughter like a bridge that could either be crossed or burned, and Angela found herself holding her breath as she watched Gregory's face cycle through a series of emotions that he seemed unable to control or hide. Surprise giving way to recognition, giving way to something that looked like the kind of pain that comes from finally seeing a truth that you have been avoiding because it was too terrible to acknowledge directly. And she realized that this moment represented everything she had been fighting for during the hearing, the possibility that Emily's voice might finally be heard and understood by the person whose opinion mattered most to her in the entire world. The transformation that occurred in Gregory Parker's face as his daughter's words sank in was nothing short of extraordinary, like watching a dam break after years of holding back water that had been building pressure behind carefully constructed walls of professional composure and emotional self-protection. And Angela found herself witnessing something she had hoped for but had not dared to expect, the moment when a parent finally hears their child's pain, not as criticism or accusation, but as a desperate plea for connection from someone who loves them unconditionally, despite the ways they have failed to provide the nurturing and affection that should have been as natural as breathing. Gregory's hands, which had been clenched at his sides in the rigid posture he had maintained throughout the hearing, slowly relaxed and opened, and Angela could see him struggling with the impulse to reach for Emily, to bridge the physical distance that had become symbolic of all the emotional barriers he had erected between himself and his daughter in his misguided attempt to protect them both from the vulnerability that came with acknowledging how much they needed each other and how frightening it was to love someone completely when you had already experienced the devastating loss of the person who had been the center of your world for so many years. For a long moment, Gregory simply stood there looking at Emily as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time in months, taking in the evidence of her emotional exhaustion and the way she had learned to make herself small and undemanding in hopes of earning the affection that should have been her birthright. And Angela could see the exact moment when the full weight of what he had done to his daughter hit him like a physical blow. The recognition that his attempts to maintain control and emotional distance had not protected Emily from pain, but had instead created a different kind of suffering that was in many ways more cruel than the honest grief they could have shared together if he had been brave enough to admit that losing Sarah had broken something in him that he didn't know how to fix. The silence stretched between father and daughter like a chasm that had been years in the making, filled with all the unexpressed love and unacknowledged hurt that had accumulated during the months when Gregory had been too afraid of his own vulnerability to recognize that Emily needed him to be human and fallible and present rather than strong and distant and impenetrably composed. When Gregory finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion in a way that Emily had not heard since the day of her mother's funeral, when she had been too young to fully understand what was happening, but old enough to recognize that something fundamental had changed in her world, and that the father who had once swept her up in spontaneous hugs and told her silly jokes to make her laugh had been replaced by someone who looked the same, but felt like a stranger wearing her daddy's face. "Emily, sweetheart, I need you to listen to me very carefully because this is the most important thing I will ever say to you," Gregory said, and Angela watched as he slowly lowered himself to his knees on the hallway floor, bringing himself to Emily's eye level in a gesture that she had tried to make earlier, but which carried so much more weight coming from the man whose approval and affection Emily had been desperately seeking for so long. "You have never needed to earn my love, not for one single second of your beautiful life, and I am so sorry that I let my own sadness and fear make you think that there was something wrong with you or something you needed to do differently to deserve the hugs and kisses and words of love that should have been yours every single day, no matter what grades you brought home or how perfectly you followed the rules, or how quiet you were when I was having a difficult day. Angela felt tears gathering in her own eyes as she watched this moment unfold, recognizing it as the kind of breakthrough that could change the entire trajectory of a child's life if it was followed by consistent action and genuine commitment to rebuilding the relationship that had been damaged by months of emotional neglect and misguided attempts at protective distance. And she found herself thinking about all the children she had encountered over the years who had never received this kind of acknowledgement from the adults who had failed them, never heard the words that could begin to heal the wounds that had been inflicted through carelessness or fear or simple inability to recognize that children need emotional nourishment as much as they need food and shelter and educational opportunities. Emily stared at her father with an expression of cautious hope mixed with the kind of wariness that comes from being disappointed too many times to trust easily in promises of change, and Angela could see her weighing Gregory's words against her experiences of the past few months, trying to determine whether this moment represented a genuine shift in their relationship or simply another adult saying things they thought she wanted to hear without really understanding what she needed or being willing to follow through with the kind of consistent emotional availability that would prove their sincerity over time. "Do you really mean that, Daddy?" Emily asked, her voice so small and uncertain that it seemed to echo in the hallway, despite the soft carpeting and sound-dampening materials that were supposed to create an atmosphere of calm and privacy for the difficult conversations that took place in this building every day. "Because I've been trying so hard to be perfect for so long, and I don't think I know how to just be your little girl without worrying about whether I'm good enough or smart enough or well-behaved enough to deserve your love." Gregory's response was immediate and instinctive in a way that suggested something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what Emily needed from him, and Angela watched as he opened his arms wide in an invitation that carried none of the conditional quality that had characterized his interactions with his daughter for months, but instead offered the kind of unconditional acceptance that Emily had been starving for since her mother's death, had changed everything about the emotional landscape of their family. "Come here, baby girl," Gregory said, his voice breaking slightly on the endearment that he had not used since Emily was much younger, and Angela held her breath as she watched Emily hesitate for just a moment before launching herself into her father's embrace with all the pent-up longing and desperate need for connection that she had been holding back for so long. "You never ever have to earn my love. You are my daughter, and that means you are the most precious thing in my world, no matter what. I love you when you get perfect grades, and I love you when you make mistakes. I love you when you're happy, and I love you when you're sad. I love you when you're easy to be around, and I love you when you're having a difficult day. I love you simply because you exist, because you are Emily Parker, because you are mine, and I am yours, and nothing will ever change that." The sight of father and daughter holding each other in the hallway of the family services building, both of them crying, but for the first time in months, crying together rather than separately, was one of the most profoundly moving things Angela had ever witnessed in her years of police work, and she found herself thinking about the chain of events that had led to this moment, starting with Emily's brave decision to walk into a police station on a stormy night and ask the questions that no child should have to ask, but which had ultimately opened the door to the kind of honest conversation that could begin to heal the wounds that had been festering in their relationship for far too long. As Angela watched Gregory hold his daughter with the kind of desperate tenderness that spoke to how much he had missed this connection and how frightened he had been of allowing himself to be vulnerable enough to offer and receive the kind of love that Emily needed, she realized that her own role in this story was far from over, because helping Emily and Gregory find their way back to each other was only the beginning of a process that would require ongoing support and guidance, and the kind of patient commitment that went far beyond the official duties that had first brought her into their lives. "Daddy, I missed you so much," Emily whispered against Gregory's shoulder, her small arms wrapped around his neck with the fierce grip of someone who had been afraid that if she let go, he might disappear again into the emotional distance that had defined their relationship for so many painful months. "I miss the way you used to hug me good morning, and the way you used to ask me about my dreams, and the way you used to tell me stories about when you and Mommy were young and in love." Gregory pulled back slightly so that he could look into Emily's eyes, his hands gently framing her face in a gesture that was tender and protective and filled with the kind of present moment awareness that had been missing from their interactions for far too long. And when he spoke, his voice carried a promise that Angela hoped he would have the strength and commitment to keep not just in this emotional moment, but in all the ordinary, everyday moments that would test his resolve to be the father that Emily deserved. "I missed you too, sweetheart, even when I was right there in the same house with you." Gregory said his honesty about his own failures, creating space for the kind of authentic relationship that could grow stronger over time, rather than remaining fragile and dependent on perfect behavior from both parties. "I was so scared of feeling sad about Mommy that I forgot how to feel happy about you, and that was wrong and unfair and something I never want to do to you again. From now on, we're going to talk about our feelings, even the difficult ones, because that's what families do when they love each other." Angela knew that this moment, as beautiful and healing as it was, represented only the beginning of the work that Gregory and Emily would need to do together to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of honest communication and emotional availability, rather than the rigid rules and conditional affection that had nearly destroyed their connection entirely. But she also knew that they had taken the most important step by acknowledging the truth about what had been missing from their relationship and making a commitment to do better, not just in this moment of crisis, but in all the ordinary moments that would follow when the intensity of this breakthrough had faded and they were left with the daily challenge of choosing love and presence over fear and distance. 2 months after that transformative moment in the hallway of the Family Services building, Angela found herself standing in the kitchen of Gregory and Emily's home on a Saturday morning in late December, watching father and daughter navigate what had become a weekly ritual that would have been unimaginable during the dark months when their relationship had been defined by rigid rules and conditional affection rather than the easy warmth and genuine connection that now characterized their interactions with each other. Emily stood on a small step stool beside the kitchen counter, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail that was already dusted with flour, her face bright with the kind of unguarded joy that Angela had rarely seen during those first weeks when the little girl had seemed to carry the weight of the world on her small shoulders, and Gregory moved around the kitchen with a relaxed confidence that spoke to how much he had changed since learning to prioritize his daughter's emotional needs over his own fear of vulnerability and loss. They were making pancakes together, a simple enough activity that had somehow become symbolic of all the ways their relationship had been rebuilt on a foundation of shared experiences and mutual affection, rather than the performance-based dynamic that had nearly destroyed their connection entirely. And Angela felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she watched them laugh together over Emily's attempt to flip a pancake that was probably too large for her small hands to manage successfully. The transformation in their home environment was remarkable in ways that went far beyond the obvious changes, like the relaxed morning routines and the easy physical affection that now characterized their interactions, extending to subtler but equally important shifts in the emotional atmosphere that had once felt heavy with unspoken expectations and the kind of walking on eggshells tension that develops when family members are afraid of triggering each other's pain or disappointment. The house itself seemed brighter somehow, not because of any changes to the lighting or decor, but because it was now filled with the sounds of genuine conversation and spontaneous laughter rather than the careful silence that had once dominated their interactions. And Angela could see evidence everywhere of the ways that Emily had begun to reclaim her childhood, now that she no longer felt responsible for managing her father's emotional state or earning his approval through perfect behavior and academic achievement. Her drawings were displayed prominently on the refrigerator, not because they demonstrated exceptional skill or artistic talent, but simply because Gregory had learned to celebrate his daughter's creative expression as valuable in its own right. And her toys and books were scattered throughout the living room in the kind of comfortable disorder that spoke to a child who felt secure enough in her home to leave traces of her presence in every room, rather than confining herself to designated spaces where she wouldn't accidentally create inconvenience for the adults around her. Angela's role in their lives had evolved significantly over the past 2 months, shifting from that of an official advocate and crisis intervention specialist to something more like an honorary family member who provided ongoing support and guidance as Gregory and Emily continued to navigate the complex process of rebuilding their relationship while also processing the grief and trauma that had created the problems in the first place. She visited them regularly, sometimes in an official capacity, to check on Emily's well-being and document the progress they were making for the family services case file, but more often simply as someone who cared about them both and wanted to be part of their journey toward healing and connection. And she had discovered that watching their relationship flourish was providing her with a kind of emotional fulfillment that she had never experienced in her official police work, no matter how many crimes she solved or reports she filed with meticulous attention to procedural detail. "Angela, look what I can do now," Emily called out from her position at the stove, carefully maneuvering a spatula under a pancake that was golden brown and perfectly round, her voice filled with the kind of pride that comes not from achieving perfection, but from being celebrated for trying new things and taking age-appropriate risks without fear of criticism or disappointment from the adults who were supposed to support her learning and growth. "Daddy taught me how to wait until I see the little bubbles on top before I try to flip it, and if I mess up, he says we can just call it a funny-shaped pancake and eat it anyway, because it will taste just as good, even if it doesn't look like the ones in the cookbooks." Angela smiled as she watched Gregory beam with genuine pride at his daughter's accomplishment, recognizing in his expression the kind of unconditional celebration that Emily had been starving for during those months when every interaction had been filtered through expectations and judgments about whether her performance met adult standards, rather than being appreciated for the effort and enthusiasm she brought to every new experience. This was exactly the kind of moment that Angela had hoped to see when she first spoke up at that hearing 2 months ago, risking her professional reputation and career prospects to advocate for a different approach to Emily's situation. And she felt a deep sense of validation, knowing that her willingness to break protocol and speak from her heart rather than her training manual had contributed to creating the conditions that allowed this kind of healing and growth to occur. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Angela said, moving closer to the counter so that she could admire Emily's handiwork and provide the kind of enthusiastic encouragement that helped reinforce the message that her efforts were valued regardless of the outcome. A lesson that was still relatively new for both Emily and Gregory, but which was becoming more natural with practice and conscious attention to the ways they communicated appreciation and support for each other. "You're becoming quite the chef, and I love seeing how happy you look when you're cooking with your daddy." The comment prompted Emily to turn toward her father with an expression of pure adoration that would have been heartbreaking just a few months earlier, because it would have been met with emotional distance and redirection toward more productive activities, but which now elicited the kind of warm, immediate response that spoke to how much Gregory had learned about the importance of being present and emotionally available in the ordinary moments that made up the fabric of their daily life together. "We cook together every Saturday morning now," Emily announced, her voice carrying the kind of satisfied ownership that children develop when they have established routines and traditions that make them feel valued and included in the family unit, rather than like guests who must constantly prove their worthiness to remain. "And sometimes during the week too, when Daddy gets home from work early enough, and he lets me choose what we make, and he doesn't get upset anymore when I spill things or forget to wash my hands first, because he says that's just part of learning, and that making messes together is more fun than being perfect and lonely." Angela felt her throat tighten slightly at Emily's words, recognizing in them evidence of just how much progress both father and daughter had made in developing the kind of relationship that prioritized connection over control and emotional intimacy over behavioral compliance. And she found herself thinking about all the other children who were struggling in homes where love was conditional and affection was withheld as a form of discipline or control, wondering how many of them might benefit from the kind of intervention that had helped Emily find her voice and helped Gregory learn to listen to what his daughter actually needed rather than what he thought she should need based on his own fears and limitations. Gregory looked up from the pancake batter he was stirring, his eyes meeting Angela's across the warm, flour-dusted kitchen, and she could see in his expression a combination of gratitude and wonder. that suggested he was still sometimes surprised by how much joy and fulfillment he was finding in this new approach to parenting, as if he had discovered a secret that had been hidden in plain sight all along, but which he had been too afraid or too rigid in his thinking to recognize and embrace until circumstances forced him to confront the limitations of his previous approach. "I can't believe I almost lost all of this because I was too scared to admit that I didn't know how to be both mother and father to Emily," Gregory said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of reflective honesty that had become characteristic of his interactions with Angela as he continued to process the ways that his grief and fear had nearly destroyed the most important relationship in his life. "I thought I was protecting her by maintaining emotional distance and focusing on structure and achievement, but what I was really doing was protecting myself from having to feel the full weight of losing Sarah and figure out how to be vulnerable and present for Emily when I felt like I was barely holding myself together." Angela nodded, understanding from her own experience with loss and trauma how easy it was to convince yourself that emotional distance was a form of strength rather than a form of self-protection that ultimately caused more harm than the vulnerability you were trying to avoid, and she appreciated Gregory's willingness to continue examining his motivations and choices even now that their relationship had improved dramatically, because that kind of ongoing self-reflection was essential for maintaining the changes they had made, rather than allowing old patterns to reassert themselves during times of stress or difficulty. The important thing is that you recognized what was happening, and you were willing to do the hard work of changing, not just for Emily's sake, but for your own, Angela said, her voice carrying the kind of gentle affirmation that she had learned was essential for supporting people who were in the process of transforming long-established patterns of behavior and emotional response. "And look at what you've created together now. Emily is thriving. You're both happier, and you have the kind of relationship that will be able to weather whatever challenges come your way because it's built on honesty and mutual respect rather than fear and control." As if to illustrate Angela's point, Emily chose that moment to accidentally drop her spatula, sending a small splatter of pancake batter across the kitchen floor. And instead of the tense silence and careful cleanup that would have characterized such a moment just a few months earlier, the kitchen erupted in laughter as both Emily and Gregory reached for paper towels and began cleaning up the mess together, turning what could have been a source of stress and criticism into an opportunity for connection and shared amusement. And Angela felt her heart swell with the knowledge that this was exactly what healing looked like, not dramatic gestures or perfect moments, but the accumulation of small, ordinary interactions that demonstrated love and acceptance in ways that built trust and security over time. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this journey. If Emily's story touched something deep within you, a memory, a fear, a hope you're not alone. This wasn't just a story about a little girl and a broken father. It was about the quiet strength that grows from love, the courage to speak up, and the healing power of compassion. Officer Angela didn't just offer safety. She offered something many children long for but rarely receive: understanding without condition. And through her, Emily found what every child deserves: not perfection, but presence. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Every view, every listener brings this message a little further: that kindness matters, that healing is possible, and that even the smallest voices can spark real change. If this story resonated with you, give it a like, hit subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support means the world truly. Until next time, thank you for being here. Stay safe, stay kind, and remember, sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply listen. See you in the next story.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.